Hi, this is Mike Carter, Carter Custom Knives. Today I want to show you how I make a slotted guard. Now normally with a full tang knife you would make a guard like this, where you cut a slot that fits the tang and it slides up against these shoulders right here. But today we're going to do one that's a little different. I've got this little skinner and you can see I've cut a little slot right here. This is a 1/8 inch wide slot because I'm going to use a 1/8 inch thick piece of brass. And the guard's just going to slide up over the blade and extend down below the blade just a little bit to serve as a finger guard. And it's a pretty simple operation, but I'll just show you how I do it. So as I said, this slot I've cut in the bottom is 1/8 of an inch wide because I'm going to use a 1/8 inch piece of brass. And this is 1/8 by 1 inch by 12 inches. So what we're going to do is I'm going to cut a slot right in the center of this that will match this slot here, and it's going to go up on, slide up onto the blade. It's going to slide all the way up to the top, actually just a little bit past the top so I can grind it down flush, and it's going to stick down below the knife a little bit so we have a finger guard. So the first thing we need to do is measure just how long this needs to be. How far down do we want it to stick below the knife for guard. And normally on things like this, give yourself a little extra. I mean, brass and some of these materials are fairly cheap, so if you use an extra 1/8 or 1/4 inch that you end up grinding off, not really a big deal, but it's better to give yourself a little extra than to come up short. Okay, so we have our blade, and as I said, I have a 1/8 inch wide slot cut in this blade for the guard. So I'm going to take a piece of 1/8 inch brass, 1 inch wide, and it's going to go like this and stick out just a little bit above the blade so that I can grind it flush later, and it's going to stick out about 3/8 of an inch below the blade. That will serve as my finger guard. So what I'm going to need to do is to slot this brass so that it will slide up all the way up over this blade. So the first thing I'm going to do is mark how long I want this guard to be. Now, as I said, I want it to stick a little bit above the blade so I can grind it flush later. So I'll just leave a little bit sticking out there. And then I'm going to come down about 3/8 to 1/2 an inch below the blade. Let's call it 1/2. We can always shorten it up. And I'm going to make my mark there. So that's how long our guard's going to be. Now we also need to cut a slot up the center of this guard. So we can see that slot is going to need to go from the top of the slot I cut in the blade all the way up. So this much of it is going to be slotted. Now of course we want the slot in the center, so we'll mark a center line. Now I know this brass is 1 inch wide, so I'll just set this to make a mark at a 1/2 inch. And that's where my slot's going to be. So I'm going to leave this longer piece attached to it. I'm not going to cut it off here until we're done drilling and milling, because it's just easier to, gives you something more to hold on to. So the next thing we need to do is cut our slot in this piece. Now this section of the blade where the slot's going to go up, or where the guard's going to go up over the blade, is 5/32 of an inch thick. So that's how wide we need to cut our slot in the guard. Now since we are going to cut a 5/32 inch slot in here, actually I'm going to start it by drilling a 1/8 inch hole, and I'll use a 1/8 inch milling bit and just widen it out to 5/32. So first thing I'm going to do is just make a little center punch so I can drill the hole, and this will give me something for my bit to get started in. So I'm going to drill a hole right there, and then we'll mill it. Okay, I've got a 1/8 inch bit mounted in my drill press here, so we'll drill that 1/8 inch hole. Okay, now that I've got my starting point here, I've got a 1/8 inch hole drilled, and I need to extend that hole into a slot the length of this guard from here up. So I'm going to mount it up in my drill press, or my milling machine. And I have a 1/8 inch end mill mounted in this. So all I'm going to do is start at that hole and take a bunch of little bites and just keep extending it until I've made a slot through the end of that guard. So there I'm lined up with the hole. As I said, I'm just taking a series of little bites. This 1/8 inch brass cuts pretty easily. But you can see what's happening there. Now I'm going to stop just short of the end here because I've got a 1/8 inch slot here. I used a 1/8 inch bit. So what I need to do is widen this out a little bit to 5/32 of an inch. If I went ahead and cut this all the way out just because it's clamped together in this vise, it could squeeze this together a little bit and throw me off. So I'm going to widen all this slot out to 5/32, and then the very last thing, I'll go ahead and cut it through to the end because a little bit of this is going to be ground off anyway. Okay, we'll see where we are. 5/32 of an inch is 0.156. And we're at 0.128, which 125 is 1/8 of an inch, so we're just slightly over 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to go back through and widen that out just a little bit by moving my table just slightly forward and back, so that cutter just shaves a little bit off the edges of this slot. Okay, we're at 131, so we need to go a little bit more. Shave a little bit off the other side. We're at 138. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and finish cutting my slot at the end here. And there we are. Got our slot cut. That is the wonderful thing about a milling machine. That's just so much faster, easier, and more precise than the old school way of drilling a bunch of holes and then taking a file and connecting all the holes. Okay, so we got our blade and we got our guard with the slot cut in it, and hopefully they'll match up pretty close fit. And that's pretty darn close. But you see, it's not going all the way up. And the reason is the round milling bit leaves a round bottom of that slot. So now I'm just going to take a little 1/8 inch square file and square off the end of this slot, and that should let it fit up real nice. This is just a little 1/8 inch square file, and you can see I've taken that round end of the slot and turned it into a nice square end. Now we should get a pretty good fit on the blade here. Nice and snug. That is a pretty darn good fit. The brass just barely above the spine of the blade here. Nice and tight, both sides. So that's about what I want. Now before I solder this into place, this is my test fit. I'm going to take it back off because I want to finish this blade just a little bit more. And you want to be sure that you have the blade finish where you want it, or pretty much where you want it, before you solder the guard in place, just because it's so hard to get back in here and work on it if you need to finish that part of the blade once the guard's there. So I'm going to take this back off, finish my blade a little bit, and then we'll be ready to solder this in place. What I'm doing here is just taking some of the fine scratches out with a Trizac A30 belt, which is about 600 grit. Now, I mirror polish a lot of my blades, but this one I'm going to do more of a brush finish, so I'm going to finish up with a Trizac A16 belt, which is about 800 grit. another thing I like to do is, even though I'm going to mess this up a little bit when I solder it, I want to go ahead and sand and polish this guard before I solder it in place. So I'll take my disc sander here and knock the hind spots off, and then hit it with some sandpaper. I tell you, I found that some bars of brass are much flatter and smoother than others. Some of them you really have to grind on them to get them flat. This wasn't bad here on this piece. So now I'm going to hand sand this a little bit, and then we'll polish it. Okay, I'm just going to take some 600 grit sandpaper and finish smoothing this out. Okay, we got it pretty well sanded down. I'm not going to worry about these edges or the end because they're going to be ground down anyway. The edges will be ground to contour with the handle, and the ends are going to be ground off. So I'm just worried about the surfaces right now. So now we'll put a little polish on it. Now I'll go to a little softer wheel and some green compound. This will be ready to go. You can see how doing all of this before cutting it to length makes it a lot easier to work with, having this nice long handle to hold on to. And that'll work. I am going to mess it up when I solder it, and I'll have to clean it up and polish it again, but when you got a nice smooth surface to begin with, it's a lot easier to get any stray solder off of it and clean it up afterwards. Okay, we want to get a good clean solder joint, so I want to clean this out a little bit. When you buff it, you get a little buffing compound in these slots. Really need to clean it out. And then I usually take either brake cleaner or carburetor cleaner. And really clean it up. Especially getting inside this slot is the most important. And right around the slot where the solder is going to be. Okay, we're ready to mount this thing up. Okay, you want to get everything ready because this goes kind of quickly. I'm doing silver solder, so I'm just going to use a propane torch. I've got my Stay Bright silver solder and my Stay Clean Flux. I've got a little brush to brush off any excess solder. And I've got my blade and my guard. So we're going to go ahead and fit the guard up here. And you can see it's going to go in that slot. That's going to lock the bottom in place. Now since I've been finishing on the knife a little bit, took maybe a thousandths off of it, it's just a touch loose. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hammer and give it a good smack. And that'll tighten it up. You can see we got a pretty good fit, no gaps. We're up just a little bit above the spine so I can grind that down nice and flush. We're up in that slot. The bottom is locked into place. So we're ready to solder. And I hope this shows up well on camera. I'm going to take a very small bead of this flux. It's a liquid flux. And put it right where the guard meets the tang. Now I'm going to start heating it up. And I'm directing my flame mostly on the knife tang right below the guard, because the brass guard is going to heat up much faster than the steel tang, and you want them about the same temperature. When the flux is ready, it'll start to turn kind of brown. When you see that turning brown, you're about ready to lay your solder down. And that's it. once this cools down, you can see we do have a little cleanup to do there, but the cleanup should go pretty easy. Okay, our solder is cooled. I put a little tape on the blade here just to help protect, keep from scratching this up while I work. You can see we got the solder front and back side of the guard, so we know it flowed through and we got a good solid solder joint. And we don't have a lot to clean up on the front side. But I want to smooth that bead out a little bit, clean it up, and then I'll lightly sand, like 800 grit, sand this guard a little bit more and then buff it again, get it shiny again. A little bit more on the back side. I already knocked a couple of drops off here that it's not as important as far as looks to clean up the back side, but you do want to get a good square fit here at this joint, so when you put your handle scales on, you don't have anything that's holding it back and keeping it from getting a good flush fit with this guard. So what I use to clean them up is I just took a little piece of square brass and I ground it at an angle, so I've got a nice sharp edge here. That's what I call a graver, and I can lay that right in that joint and scrape the solder out. And being brass, of course, it's softer than the steel of the blade, so it's not going to scratch up my blade. See, and scrape that brass right, or that solder right out of there. And same thing on the back side. You can use that graver. It's a little messier back here, but you can use that graver to scrape your solder out of there. Okay, we've got it, most of the solder, using my graver, I've got it pretty cleaned up away from the blade here. Obviously the brass guard itself needs some cleanup now, and as I said, I'm going to sand that down a little bit and then buff it again. I've also knocked off all the solder here in this joint on the back side so that my handle scales can get a good flush fit up to the guard. So what I'm going to do now to protect my blade right here where it meets the guard is I'm going to put some tape on that, so when I'm sanding the guard, it just protects the blade from getting any sanding scratches in it. Now I can just take some sandpaper and start cleaning up the guard here. And I can get up real close to the blade, clean that little bit of solder splash off. Okay, I sanded it down and hit it on the buffer again. So we've got it pretty well cleaned up. Got a nice clean solder joint. good and solid. So we'll get the handles on it and then grind this top down flush. Contour these guards, grind them down even with the handle. Round this out a little bit here, give it a nice curve to it. Probably shorten it up just a little bit. It's a little longer than what it needs to be. I mean, this is just a little 3-finger Skinner anyway, but so I think we're about ready to fit up some handles. Just looking through my handle material here, and got some armadillo. That armadillo hide is pretty thin, so I've laminated it to some micarta. But I think that might look pretty neat on this knife. Okay, I've glued up one side of my armadillo handle here on this knife, and I just put some epoxy on it and clamped it this way. Also put a clamp this way between the end of this handle scale and the guard to keep it pushed up tight against the guard, so I get a nice butt fit. You see I got a nice tight fit with no gap there against the guard. So now what I want to do is I want to drill some 3/16" holes through my holes in the tang and through the handle, and then I'll glue up the other side and drill back through it, and that way I know my holes are perfectly aligned. And I'm going to put some leveless bolts in these, so I'm going to drill some 3/16" holes through this. So there I've got my 3 pinholes drilled, and now when I glue up the other side, I can drill right back through these holes and drill through the other handle scale. Okay, as I said, I'm going to use loveless bolts on these knife handles, and since I put a brass guard on it, I'm going to use a brass loveless bolt. And in case you're not familiar with those, this is a loveless bolt. It's just simply a screw with a couple of brass collars on it. And you have about a 5/32 inch diameter screw and a 5/16 diameter collar. And in order to use these properly, you use a special bit that cuts this 5/16 inch counterbore with this wider part of the blade here. This creates a shoulder in the handle so that the bolts actually clamp the knife scales to the knife tang. There you can see what I'm doing, the shoulder I'm creating. And the wider part of this bolt will sit on that shoulder. Very, very secure way to attach a knife handle. You'll notice I'm using a piece of board here because that guard is sticking out beyond the handle at this point. So if I just lay it on a flat surface, it's going to be at an angle. So I can lay it on this board, lay the handle on the board, let that guard stick over the edge. That way my handle lays flat. Now when I use my bolt, I'll go through like that. Collar screws down on the other side and goes down into that recess. When I screw this down tight, it draws those two collars together, and then you can just grind off, cut off and grind off any excess and make it flush with the handle. Okay, we're ready to grind these leveless bolts down flush. Rather than do a whole lot of grinding, generating heat, I'm just going to cut some of the excess off with my cutoff wheel on my Dremel tool. Now I'll grind the rest of it off, and we'll start grinding the guard down to shape, grinding it flush to the handle, and grinding the leveless bolts flush to the handle. I'm just going to start off with a 60 grit belt here to knock the heavy stuff off. I want to do a little bit at a time on this brass because I don't want to get it too hot and start melting anything around it. So I'll do a little bit of that, and then I'll start grinding this handle a little closer to the tang. I'll come back and grind some more of the bolts. Well, other than a little hand sanding, some touch up and clean up, that's the slotted guard. Well, that's how I make my slotted guard. It's a little 3-finger skinner with armadillo handles. It's laminated over some micarta to give it a little thickness. Still have to do a little bit of touch up, a little final hand sanding and clean up, a little light buffing, but this one's pretty much finished. So this is Mike Carter, Carter Custom Knives, and as always, thanks for watching.